Hello and welcome to another Pure Theory Crafting for Marvel Avengers Alliance 2. Today, by request, I'm going over Age of Ultron Thor. He was something of a late draw for me. I already had a handful of scrappers by the time that I drew him and his Marvel Now counterpart. I think I actually got the two of them back to back. I have had very little actual experience with him, just enough to understand what some of his kind of vaguely listed mechanics are. But we're going to see if we can't piece together what makes him different from the Marvel Now Thor, or more specifically, makes him mechanically unique. The one thing that I will say right off the bat, even just as we go over here and go take a look at him, where the Marvel Now Thor is pretty shock heavy, the Age of Ultron Thor is based around MJOLNIR. Now, as someone who doesn't necessarily speak foreign languages very well, and who has a lot of problem mimicking an accent, I'm going to butcher that name multiple times over the course of this video. MJOLNIR, Mew Mew, call it what you will. I'm sure I'm getting it wrong no matter what I say. Taking a look at his stats, this is a fairly tough scrapper. He is not a glass cannon. He's offensive, he's high damage, but he's not a glass cannon. He's not fragile in the way that several other characters are. We'll see this as we get to his little quilt over in terms of his actual slots. He doesn't neglect his health and defense for the sake of his damage. And we'll actually see that with his only buff move and with his tactical. And we can see that right here with his leader's bonus. 10% to defense and health. He makes a decent leader if you aren't running if you don't have a tank at all, or if you're using a half tank, someone like Captain Marvel. And in fact, one of the builds that I will use as we get towards the end of the video, because I've got 3 potential builds for him, one of them makes heavy use of a character like Captain Marvel as a partner of choice. His attack is his highest stat. His health is actually his second highest stat, and his accuracy and defense are right there in the middle. When we get over here, we'll take a look and we'll see that his accuracy and his attack here do kind of end up the highest by default, but that health and defense are not very bad from there. Speed and evasion, these stay low. He is not capable of boosting these directly. And while evasion is, because he's not a tank, and because his health and defense are pretty good, speed is a critical thing for one of your primary attackers to lack, and so that'll be something we'll kind of work on building up. His passive, Wielder of MJOLNIR, grants a 40% chance to gain worthy at the start of each turn. All it says is causing blunt actions to deal additional damage over time. What this means, to the best of my knowledge, is that blunt actions then apply wounding on the turn. Wielder MJOLNIR, the worthy buff specifically, pops up at the start of his turn. Age of Ultron Thor's best comparative character is Iron Fist, and that's the one that most people are going to be familiar with. Worthy is a similar mechanic to Heart of Shulao. It pops up at the start of his turn, it is used up if he uses a blunt action, and it expires at the end of his action even if he doesn't use a blunt action, so it doesn't persist between turns. He is a spirit user, again, much like Iron Fist. In fact, those are the only 2 core spirit users that I know of off the top of my head. I'm sure that future characters will add more of them. I really expect it with Chapter 5 when they're going to add 3 new Asgardians to the list. Although technically the female Thor is not directly an Asgardian, while she's got MJOLNIR in hand, she might as well be. She's actually tougher than Asgardian than anyway. Spirit is a hybrid of Insight and Rage. Like Insight, it is generated in part when enemies attack you. Where Insight can also be built up through a handful of specific actions, especially the tactical for an Insight user, Spirit actually has several Spirit generation moves that he can use and build up just like Rage. And like Rage, he spins it on high cost moves that take up, anywhere from 50 to 60 of his spirit bar just to use one of those abilities, but that then come at a much higher amount of overall damage. Insight, once it builds up to 100, just gives them a bonus turn. The similarity between there is the fact that he does not have to be the target of the enemy action in order to gain spirit from it. If you're running him with a tank, while he's tough enough to take some hits on his own right, and he is, he's also going to build his spirit when somebody else is targeted. This means that he can be on the front line dealing damage and not necessarily have to worry so much about his health. He's tough enough to survive incidental damage, like area of effect damage, while still gaining his resource from somebody else attacking a tank. Taking a look at his abilities, there is a severe dependence on blunt attacks for him because of his passive. 5 of his 7 damage moves are blunt. Only 2 of them are purely shock. Like the Marvel Now Thor, blunt and shock are kind of his trademark moves. They are what he pairs together. Unleash MJOLNIR is a ranged blunt. This is the classic hammer throw. And its damage for a normal speed move, not the highest. This is used as a steady spirit generation move. We'll see that only one of his attacks really moves up to fast speed. He's not the fastest character. He's powerful, but he's not necessarily fast. He tends to trade the speed that some characters have for just raw offense and damage. 120 is low for a normal speed move, but his attack and accuracy together are so high, instead of just one or the other, that I expect this to be on par with most other characters' basic move. It applies Crushed with a 100% chance. This is one of those moves where, kinda like that passive of his, we don't know specifically how strong Crushed really is. All it says, defensive reduced effectiveness. I believe that means something along the lines, probably about 30 or 40% reduced effectiveness. Basically treating the enemy as if they only had 60% of the defense that they had. This, unlike, say, Clobbered, which does a 25% damage increase and increased speed, regardless of who you're attacking, this is going to show more effectiveness to me against a high defense target, like an enemy bruiser or a tougher character. A enemy affected by targeted, for instance, the one that assists projectile users, because targeted increases accuracy, high evasion characters are the best ones to use it against. If they already have a high defense and they have a low evasion, then targeted doesn't help you as much because you're more likely to crit and land devastates anyway. Crushed is, to me, better against high defense targets because low defense targets are probably going to take more damage anyway as long as you can hit them. With his naturally somewhat high accuracy, that's usually not going to be a problem for him. It does have Shield Breaker, and this is kind of an all-around useful thing, especially when you're dealing with PvP. I don't actually use this. One of the 3 builds I bring for him is a PvP build. I find this to be somewhat situational when it comes to Shield Breaker. This move is primarily there to apply Crushed. Thunder Strike. This is the first of 3 big spirit spenders. This one costs 60. Since spirit only goes up to 100, those 3 big spirit spenders are not designed to be used back to back. They can't be fired off multiple times in a row. This is possibly my favorite of them. It does deal 50% more damage if the target has a physical debuff. He's got like 3 that he can apply. Crushed is one of them. Thor, as we'll see as we go through these, or at least the Age of Ultron variant, is highly centered on physical buffs and debuffs. He has one that takes advantage of physical debuffs. He has one that takes advantage of physical buffs. He's capable of applying multiple instances of both. Much like Age of Ultron Black Widow was all about the tactical side, Age of Ultron Thor, all about the physical. 2-star upgrade, Critical Path. I don't know that this is more than a single hit move, but his high accuracy vastly increases the chance of this being a crit in the first place. While it will grant him another action, it doesn't necessarily, it isn't chainable. He can't do what we do with Gamora or with Angela and launch this multiple times in a row. What he can do is what we see with Nebula and with a couple other characters, where you can use the bonus turn from Critical Path to generate half or more of the spirit needed to do another Thunderstrike. So that you're using Thunderstrike effectively every other turn that he gets, because he's really going to get 3 actions for every 2. This is a really high listed base damage. It's only about 20 points weaker than his than his actual highest listed damage. It trades off a little bit of power for the higher rate of speed, and will shine as he reaches higher level, unlocks the rest of those accuracy slots, and really begins to land more consistent critical strikes. It is blunt and shock. It does benefit from both. Summon Lightning. This is his minor Spirit Spender. It only costs 50, so it can be used twice in a row if needs be. We'll see that he has 2 separate moves capable of generating 45 Spirit in a turn, and since Spirit can be generated when an enemy attacks as well, this move can be fired off after a single Spirit generating move. It is Range Shock. It is his only purely range shock. He does have another purely shock move, but that one is melee. Normal speed, like pretty much everything he's got. This one becomes a kind of a partial area of effect. It will always deal its damage to only one target, and it deals very solid damage for a normal speed attack. I normally say 160, I'm content. 220 is a high amount of damage for a normal attack. It then expands neutralized and weakened to all enemies when you use it. Weakened being a physical debuff that last move can take advantage of. Neutralizing preventing them from using strengthened to erase weakened. This I will use in one of his builds. It is kind of an oddball move for him, but that ability to spread debuffs along the enemy line does make that useful. And its high damage means that it's not wasted on him, because he is there in the role of the high damage dealer. That's kind of his first priority should always be dealing damage more than debuffs. That's what you need him for. ASGARD Calls. As an Age of Ultron character, he is based in part around that swapping out mechanic and making use of your reserves. This is his move that does that. It is a slow speed move. It gets faster. It does apply Exposed to deal more damage. Again, physical debuff, because he's all about the physical side. This does go all the way up to Fast at 4 stars. And its final damage at 242 is the highest non-finishing move that he's got. It generates 45 Spirit. The best use of this move is probably PvP. When used in PvP, where you do not have any active reserves, or if you decide to go into a PvE battle and you choose not to bring any reserves with you, it's possible. All you have to do is select an X for that, and you can go into combat with just 3 heroes. If you do not have an active reserve line, this will not swap him out. He'll do the animation and come right back in. When he does, he'll re-trigger his innate that we'll get to here in a second. This, like I said, it's a high damage attack, high damage blunt attack, that does generate 45 Spirit. It is melee. We'll see that he is capable of applying Rampage to himself, so melee is a strong attack for him. I include this in the PvP build, but it's about the only way that you're going to make consistent use of it. It's kind of an oddball move, and it's that defining feature of the Age of Ultron variants. Battle Brother, his only buff move. Normal speed doesn't get any faster. That's kind of unusual for buff moves, but it's pretty typical of Thor, who's not really a fast move user. His only fast move was ASGARD Calls, and the fact that he's going to get delayed when he swaps back in means that it's probably not really a fast move for him. It's probably closer to normal or slow speed. Gives Fortified to himself at 3 star, that is to the team. It also gives him Battle Ready. And Battle Ready is an unusual buff in that it kind of mimics the power trait for Spider-Man, like the power mode for Spider-Man, or Star-Lord's passive, his strategy passive of following up somebody else's attack with a free attack. Age of Ultron Thor's free attack is a melee blunt strike with a hammer. It is not necessarily the strongest free attack, but because of his high attack and his high accuracy, it is a consistent amount of solid damage. One of the builds that I'll give will take advantage of that. By himself, if you do not build a team around making use of that, this move will wear off pretty quickly. He's not a high-speed character, and the effectiveness of Battle Ready is going to be based on the speed of your allies. The faster your companions, the more attacks they'll be able to launch, and the more free attacks you'll get from Battle Ready. If you're going to use this, take it all the way to 4-star. Do so to drop that cooldown by another turn. The more you can keep Battle Ready up, the progressively more worthwhile it's going to be to have used it in the first place, because you're not attacking on the turn you're using this. Fortified to the team kind of highlights that whole defensive aspect he's got. He is a tough scrapper, and he kind of brings that toughness to the team with this move. It does generate 30 spirit. Because it's a spirit generator, you never have to worry about having spirit to use it. It's only dependent on that cooldown. Thunderhead Unleashed. I'm a fan of this move on paper. I am. Its damage is not terribly high, in that it only caps at 120 for a normal speed attack, which is pretty low in terms of the basic rubric that I use, but it's an area attack, and 120 for an area attack is completely acceptable. Even more so because even though it probably doesn't look like it should be, it's a melee attack, which means that it's going to benefit from the rampaging that he can apply to bring that final damage up even higher. At 4-star, it's going to generate 45 spirit, and because it's a spirit generator, this is a spammable attack. He can use it every turn if he wants to. It applies slow to the enemy line. That is a wonderful thing to see. 100% chance of slowed to all enemies on a move that can be used repeatedly. This allows him to offset his low speed by lowering everybody else's, essentially. It's not quite the same as Hindered, but by being able to use this against all enemies every turn, it's probably even better than Hindered. I use this as a core ability on 2 of the 3 builds that I put forward for him. This is a purely shock build. It will not benefit from Worthy. So those builds also include a blunt attack so that you can use it to benefit from Worthy. Because the wounded aspect of it will mean that any blunt attack will do more damage overall probably than this will. The only ability I don't have for him, the last 2-star ability, Mighty Mjolnir, is the second of the big spirit spenders. And this one, Mighty Maneuver, is based around a physical buff. He's got a couple of them. We just saw Fortified with that last one. He's also capable of applying Strengthened and Resilient to himself. Those are all 3 physical buffs that can boost the damage of this. Like the other 2 big spending moves, this one takes advantage of his accuracy. Instead of Critical Path, this one has Brutal. So he's going to hit multiple times, gaining in power on each one of them. This also has the highest listed base damage of any of his finishing moves. This is going to be a strong and powerful attack. But it's slow. And you're not going to get it faster. It's not unarmed. It's not got Critical Path. It's got nothing that's going to speed this move up, aside from maybe a teammate with Hastened. Instead, you compare this with, say, Thunderhead Unleashed or something to kind of lower the opponent's speed so that this is less of a big deal for you. This kind of highlights his, not just his accuracy, but his raw damage, where his attacks are going to hurt, but he's not going to get as many of them as most of your other heroes are, especially your faster ones. He's just not necessarily a high-speed character overall. That said, this is still going to be a extremely powerful hit. His final ability is also his final spender, and it's his only spiritual move, which means it's going to consume his entire spirit bar and do a variable amount of damage based on the amount spent. It doesn't get the plus 50% from any one thing. Instead, it can be up to quadrupled in overall damage based on the length of your current spirit bar. At 60, because we've seen that Playdom likes to make their percentage-based moves direct relation. So since 1%, 1 point of spirit is going to be about a 3% damage increase to this move, all the way up from 1 to 100, 60 spirit, the cost of the other two big spirit moves, is about 180% chance, just shy of 200 for this move, 180% bonus damage, and its final damage is pretty low listed, but if at 60 spirit, that's already being increased by 180%, in other words, it's almost 3 times that amount, you're going to look to this being one of the higher damage moves. It's probably going to be equivalent. It doesn't get that 50% increase the other two do, in exchange for starting at about, what is that, 450, almost 500 damage with the 180% increase. Anything beyond 60 just increases the overall power of this move. Ultimately, this will be the highest source of single target damage for him. It is blunt and shock. It benefits from both. Importantly, it also benefits from worthy. And if it doesn't kill them outright at 100 spirit, then wounding, which is often based on the damage of the attack, will do a lot of damage if worthy is up when you bring down the hammer. The variable nature of its spirit cost has an effect on his overall speed of his attacks. Where the other two are fixed at 60, meaning that at 100 spirit you can fire it off, use a single spirit generator, and do it again, this one will always drop you back to 0 and require you to begin refilling your spirit from scratch. You can't use this one quite as frequently as the others if you want to maintain the same amount of damage. You can use another generator and use this again, but you might only be doing so at 30 spirit and thus not doing nearly as much damage. The big trade-off here is precise. It doesn't have critical path, it doesn't have brutal strike. Instead of taking advantage of his high accuracy, it builds it even higher. Because that 25% accuracy will stack with buffs like focused and confident and wide open and everything else that increases the overall accuracy by a percentage. They all add together. So this move is very likely to be crit and devastate anything higher than what the other ones are. That is how this one increases its damage, by being able to consistently land the higher damage tiers in terms of the overall effect. I do make use of this one in the PvP build, specifically because accuracy is a premium in PvP. His tactical. He is a tough, high damage dealing scrapper. This tactical kind of shows that off. Resilient is a fairly rare buff. Not a lot of characters apply it. Both versions of Thor can, and it reduces the damage effects the damage of status effects by 75%. This is bleeding. This is wounding. This is static shock. This is volatile, I believe. All of those can be reduced by 3/4 just by having this on. It is a physical buff. Mighty Mjolnir, with its mighty maneuver, takes advantage of this. Even if you didn't bring Battle Brother so that he's not applying Fortified to the team, this can count. And Rampaging, for the 40% bonus from melee damage, can be a vast increase in his overall damage because so many of his abilities are melee. Of his 7 attacks, only I think, 2 of them are ranged, and those are Summon Lightning and Unleash Mjolnir, his very first move. Even Thunderhead Unleashed, his area of effect, is technically melee. I'm sure that it's going to look more like it should be some kind of a ranged effect. He's firing lightning at them. But it still counts as melee, and thus will still benefit from this tactical. I'm seeing a trend with spirit users, because while I really only have Iron Fist and Age of Ultron Thor to pull from, 2 is the start of a trend in a game like this. Much like rage users or stamina users, the tacticals of spirit users tends to be very fast or fast and generate 30 spirit in addition to whatever effect they do. Because he doesn't need to because his other move, because this isn't the only way that he can generate spirit, because he has spirit generation moves that can be used at 0 in his resource bar, he never truly needs to use his tactical, much like Iron Fist. You can use it if it is good and situational, maybe at the start of combat to apply rampaging if he needs it, but it becomes a real tactical. It's optional. And I like to see that in a tactical. I do like to see where it's not mandatory. I am Thor. This kind of egg. All it says is he performs a buff action, increasing ally damage when he swaps in. What that really means is that he applies strengthen to the team. When combat starts, if you swap him in from the reserves, or if you don't have a reserve line and you are using ASGARD calls, when he comes back in, his next turn will be delayed. I think they treat it like a normal or a slow speed turn. It doesn't look like it's quite as bad as it could be. I don't think it's very slow. But he does automatically give strengthen to the entire enemy line, and any of those, such as ASGARD calls, can be used to reapply it as battle is going on if strengthen happens to fall off. Strengthen being a physical buff does benefit Mighty Mjolnir as well, because he's all about the physical side. We've taken a look at the abilities. Let's take a look at the ISO slots. I like to call them E-ISOs. I know that I do. I know that I always will, probably. They are that in my mind. And so that's what comes out of the mouth. A mix. 3 defensive, 5 offensive. He's tough for a scrapper. His attack and his accuracy start pretty high. And while his attack starts higher than his accuracy, he gets 3 accuracy slots and 2 attack slots. These both become very high, equivalent stats. His ability to apply strengthened and rampaging to himself brings his overall damage even higher, and his solid accuracy can be boosted either through the precise nature of Bring Down the Hammer, or he can take advantage of that solid accuracy where he may not land consistent devastating hits, but he's probably going to land consistent critical hits, and that's enough for brutal and critical path to make use of. He does not neglect his health. It's his second highest stat, and he gets 2 slots for it. That means it's actually going to trail just behind his attack overall, and his defense, which is right in the middle, also gets in the ISO slot. This man can take a hit. Better than most other scrappers can. Definitely better than most infiltrators and tacticians probably can. He's not terribly fragile. What we see here is a lack of evasion and speed E-ISOs. Evasion, useful in PvP, maybe not a big deal in PvE. Speed, absolutely critical in all ways. His moves are not fast. Unlike, say, Winter Soldier, who Winter Soldier had an equally low speed and also didn't really get it through his slots here. But he made up for it by having extremely fast moves, and thus still gets lots of turns. Thor doesn't do that. Lots of damage, less attacks. So when you're looking at slotting in the crystals, speed, to me, is his secondary stat of choice. Not accuracy or evasion like I would for a lot of other characters. Speed. You gotta get him up to par one way or another, and the only way to do that is through the secondary stats. Afterwards, his attack is going to be pretty high. His ability to apply strength and rampaging. Go ahead and look at maybe accuracy or evasion, depending on whether you're using him in PvE or PvP. Those make good tertiary stats for him, but I would look at speed as his secondary stat of choice on all of his E-ISOs. On every one of them. ISOs, E-ISOs, whatever, my bad, whatever. In terms of set bonuses, experimental does nothing for him. Let's get that out of the way now just so we don't have to worry about it in the future. All of his buffs and debuffs are 100%. So experimental is redundant. It doesn't do anything. So don't worry about that. I don't know that Experimental counters out Indomitable by saying you have a 120% chance to apply it and the enemy has a 20% chance to resist it, I think it caps at 100%. So Experimental, don't waste your slots on it. Veiled, yes, it's a 20% attack increase, but Thor's nature as a spirit user means that he has to build his resources from the start of combat. He doesn't start with any spirit on the bar. And he's not likely to get 60 in the first round of enemy attacks. He's got to open up with one of those weaker spirit builders before he can use his higher damage spirit spenders. Veiled, I feel, has a somewhat limited use for him. That 20% attack bonus is nice, but it's kind of wasted because his opening shot's going to be the weaker shot. He's not quite like Daredevil or Black Panther, who can fire off a stealthy maneuver for bonus damage on the very first round of combat. Black Panther makes excellent use of Veiled because Shadow Strike doesn't really need anything else to do great amounts of damage. It's not the same way for Thor. Now, Veiled can be used as a defensive side, especially in PvP, but Thor's own natural toughness means that you could probably just give him a defensive set and call it good. It's better if the enemy attacks Thor than some of your other more fragile characters. He can take the hit better than they can. So I wouldn't really use... If you want to use Veiled, go for it. It's not terrible, but it's probably not the best. He is not a bad candidate for Coordinated. He doesn't necessarily have a high rate of speed on his own in his own right. And yeah, one of his builds, especially with Thunderhead Unleashed, can be used to kind of minimize the number of enemy turns, which kind of minimizes the use of Coordinated. But his high accuracy and high attack means that his free attack is going to do a good solid amount of damage. And being as damage dealing is his primary purpose in your group, Coordinated is going to be a solid set for him, especially in PvE. And in fact, I have one of the 3 builds that we'll go into after we go through the sets, makes use of Coordinated to kind of bolster him even further. In terms of defensive sets, a above average health and a pretty solid defense means that Impenetrable is not a bad set for him. He has a higher, more resistant starting 10% to his health pool than other more fragile characters like Gamora had. Barricading is always good. He doesn't have any kind of shield move of his own that he would override it with. So the only way he would get a shield is through the barricading set. It's not bad for him. Rejuvenating works as well as the others. I don't know that, because he's not a low health character, I don't know that Rejuvenating will fill him back up as fast. Which means that if somebody breaks through that Impenetrable EISO, it can maybe take him a couple of turns to get back up to that 90%. But because of Resilient from his tactical, having Rejuvenating, it's way too common that wounding does more damage than Rejuvenating heals, meaning that you will still slowly take more damage than you're actually recovering. Resilient eliminates that, allowing him to be tagged with wounding or bleeding or any of those others. And with Resilient and Rejuvenating, he can still be recovering more health than he's losing. He doesn't have any other way to recover health. Rejuvenating, not a bad set for him. If you're going to run him in PvE, Coordinated plus 1 defensive set of your choice, probably a good call. Any of them will really work for him. He's not really dependent on any one over the others in terms of his defensive sets. Because of the ability to apply Resilient via his very fast tactical, I wouldn't worry too much about Indomitable with him. It helps, it definitely does, but he doesn't need the 20% increased chance to resist those nasty damage over time effects like Wounded. Is kind of offset by the fact that he only takes a quarter of the damage from him when he is hit by him. Let's go back to his builds. I've got 3 that I kind of threw together. One of them is, the very first one is Area of Effect, Shock, and Debuff damage. It is still going to be a solid damage build, and it's going to open up with Thunderhead Unleashed. Because this is a spammable attack that generates 45 spirit and does solid damage, and because it's melee, and therefore by benefits from rampaging, this will be the core of your offense. using it to apply and maintain slowed, so that every enemy action they ever try to do is pretty much always going to be slow. This allows him to basically rain down damage on them while minimizing the number of turns they get. If he gets another turn before they do, because it's a physical debuff, he can take advantage of that with the finishing move of choice. But first, we're going to look at his other move. This is the cheaper of the two spenders that he will use with this build. And we're bringing along Summon Lightning, even though it's a rain shock and it's not blunt. Neither is Thunderhead Unleashed. Neither one of those two is blunt. Neither one's going to benefit from Worthy. You're bringing this along because of the ability to debuff the entire enemy line with Neutralized and Weakened. So Neutralized, Weakened, and Slowed. Because this costs 50 Spirit instead of 60, a single Thunderhead Unleashed at 4 stars, and that will be the priority move to get to 4 star. Get this to 2 or 3 stars, get the finishing move for this build to 2 or 3 stars, but get Thunderhead Unleashed to 4 stars so that you can get that 45 Spirit. So that this only needs one enemy to attack. If one enemy attacks, you're going to get a minimum of 5 Spirit. That's enough to be able to use Summon Lightning right there on the second turn and throw debuffs all across the enemy line. Your big source of individual single target damage and what you will use Worthy for is Thunder Strike. Because it is blunt, it's going to be the only move in this build that benefits from Worthy to apply its damage over time effect. This is going to be how you kill the big targets when you're not using Thunderhead Unleashed to take down the smaller targets in an area of effect attack. The plus 50% damage if the target has a physical debuff. Both of his other moves apply physical debuffs. Critical Path means that even though you're spending 60 Spirit, as soon as you land a crit, you're immediately following this up with, say, another Thunderhead Unleashed, bypassing the slow speed of this to use a normal speed move to follow it up with. It is melee, unlike Summon Lightning, but like Thunderhead Unleashed, it's going to benefit from Rampaging. So your two highest sources of damage are going to benefit from Rampaging. But a quick look at the very last point of damage on this. If Thunderhead Unleashed does 120 damage and this does 220, the 40% bonus from Rampaging means that this is still the higher damage against a single target, even if this one is ranged. So don't feel bad about swapping in and using Summon Lightning. It's going to be more damage against one target than Thunderhead Unleashed is, while still applying its debuff to the enemy line. So here in his 3 abilities, you're applying 3 debuffs to all enemies. You are using 3 shock moves. All of these are shock. Even though only one is blunt, all of them will take advantage of shock. It's not really his big focus. I believe Marvel Now Thor, because of his passive, does shock better. This move can be used alongside, say, Electro, to apply static shock to the enemy line and then just rain down powerful, self-buffed area of effect attacks from both characters. And use those two alongside maybe a well-ISO'd Wasp, who is running, a bunch of defensive buffs, or a bunch of defensive things, and have her tank, so that she's rejuvenating. She has her impenetrable. She's only taking glancing hits anyway. He can give her fortified, which Wasp can't give herself. And her low defense means that she needs it. Although you wouldn't give fortified in this particular line, I suppose. So ignore that portion of it. That's just me running my mouth. But use this alongside, say, other shock characters or other area of effect characters. While it does apply good debuffs, good physical debuffs to the enemy line, the real purpose is the high overall damage of all of these attacks. He is going to be a primary damage dealer even with this particular build. The second build, in the post, I called this one Blitzkrieg, and although I know the pun is in German instead of Norse, calling this one Lightning War was way too good to pass up for Thor. Every now and then you've got to make yourself laugh, or life's just not fun. This particular build is based around specific teammates, ideally Captain Marvel, for her frenzied and hastened buffs. This build is going to use Battle Brother, and this is going to be central to it. If any move is going to be taken to 4-star, it's this, to get that reduced cooldown. You're going to throw up Battle Ready. You're going to do this almost right off the bat. Doing it with faster characters, or Captain Marvel's ability to apply hasten to the team to speed up everybody, means you're going to get a bigger benefit to this. Battle Ready will work with Frenzied, because Battle Ready only adds its free attack when somebody else does their attack. Frenzy does it when you do it, allowing you to follow any attack from your team with a free attack from Age of Ultron Thor. This build is meant to be used with the coordinated EISO set in PvE in order to have free attacks when you attack, free attacks when your allies attack, and a 50% chance for free attacks when the enemies attack. This allows Age of Ultron Thor to use free attacks at a rate that the Marvel Now variant, to the best of my knowledge, simply cannot. But it needs a team. Battle Ready and Coordinated alone make up the bulk of his free attacks, but he needs somebody who can give him Frenzied, and he needs somebody who can increase his overall speed, or off-balanced. It'll work well if you can apply Area of Effect off-balanced as well. Because his free attack is melee, it'll benefit from rampaging, it'll benefit from his high attack and his high accuracy. If somebody else can apply the off-balance or frenzy buffs to him, he can use Battle Brother to great, and coordinated ISOs to great effect. In order to pair it with this, because this is a spirit generator, let's go ahead and give him another one. And while Thunderhead Unleashed is definitely a potential ability, I went ahead and said let's go ahead and give him Unleash MJOLNIR. The reason being is that this particular build makes heavy use of blunt attacks. So Crushed is going to be very solid for this. You're only going to use Unleash MJOLNIR from time to time. You're going to be spending the rest of your turns trying to use his finishing move whenever you have Spirit, and using Battle Brother on cooldown. And you'll probably make use of his tactical to keep up rampaging stuff, which will also generate 30 Spirit. So this move will be used intermittently to apply Crush to the tougher enemies, and also when it needed to destroy shields. The finishing move here is once again Thunderstrike. I did think about putting in Mighty MJOLNIR, but what we're going to use here is we're going to take advantage of Critical Path. Getting an extra action every so and so often will accelerate the cooldown rate of Battle Brother, and that's the important part of this build. The more frequently you can use Battle Brother, and Thunderstrike will assist with that, the better this build is going to work in practice. In theory, we can see all the numbers and everything, but in practice, Thor's got to be able to get more turns out there, and this lets him do it. Seeing as this and seeing as, say, this would be the overall build, these two right here, they're both blunt attacks. They do take advantage of Worthy. His free attack is blunt. We'll take advantage of Crushed as applied here. This one is all about the blunt damage. While yes, Thunderstrike does have shock, it's the only thing out of this whole thing that'll have shock. Instead, it's about making a slow character like Thor, who's all about the high damage, making him chain free attacks every time somebody else does an attack. It's the whole reason I called it Blitzkrieg. The final build I did for him will work functionally better in PvP than it will probably anywhere else. It is maybe a little bit higher investment in terms of the overall cost between abilities. ASGARD Calls is a high spirit generation move, and it's also very high damage. 240 for this attack, and the fact that there's no spirit requirement makes this a very powerful move. In PvP, when you don't have reserves, he doesn't swap out. He does this move and then triggers his passive, reapplying strength to the team. So this can be viewed as a high damage single target attack that applies exposed to the enemy and strengthen to your entire team. With all the people running around with Wasp, and Weaken therefore being applied all the time, having this allows you to occasionally remove Weakened and reapply strengthened as needed. Thunderhead Unleashed is a great area of effect damage if the enemy is running lots and lots of coordinated EISOs, Area attack abilities do not trigger coordinated. Now, yeah, they trigger things like, I think they trigger Overwatch. They definitely trigger pre-counters, like Heimdall and Iron Fist especially. But it negates coordinated. The 45 spirit that it can generate at 4 stars and its acceptable damage there means that he's using 2 separate 45 spirit generation abilities, so that even after just 1 or 2 actions, he can pull out Bring Down the Hammer. And he can do this at a high spirit cost. Now, part of the reason I chose Bring Down the Hammer over Mighty Mjolnir, when he could definitely use that one just as well, is because in PvP, accuracy is a premium. There's entirely too many high evasion characters. This lets him consistently hit them with a high damage attack. He himself is a solidly high accuracy character. Having the additional accuracy from this, and of course if he can get focus from a teammate, that's even better. It allows him to bypass the high accuracy of characters like Black Widow and potentially Wasp. Because this move has a variable spirit cost, if you just need to go ahead and finish off that enemy before they can sneak in another attack, the 45 stamina base from his other 2 abilities means he can fire this off at the second round, and 45 spirit is only going to be slightly weaker than the 60 spirit finishing moves he had for the other options. It gives him a little bit more flexibility in when he uses it, in addition to being more likely to land it. Because you have 2 blunt attacks and 2 shock attacks, he can potentially synergize pretty well. All of these are melee, so rampaging helps all of them. And 2 of them, the 2 high damage single target ones, are blunt, and thereby benefit from worthy. So this build was meant as I think I called it something like he loves his hammer, which is totally a quote from the first Avengers movie. And it's all about that bring down the hammer and when he's going to use it. Every one of these, Mjolnir is right there in the middle of the picture, and it's a defining trait of Age of Ultron Thor. I'm going to use that to roll into the final thoughts for him. Age of Ultron Thor and Marvel Now Thor both are damage-dealing scrappers who have both single target and area of effect options. The greatest difference that I can see looking at them is that Age of Ultron Thor loves the hammer. He's all about the blunt attacks. His shock attacks are either mixed in with his blunt options, or they're few and far between otherwise. Marvel Now Thor has dedicated range shock attacks, and his passive gives him an area of effect shock-based attack that's not actually a free attack. It just kind of goes off in addition to it. That makes Marvel Now Thor the better option between the 2 for a static shock team, because he's going to get just as many shock attacks, but he's going to trigger static shock more frequently than the Age of Ultron Thor variant will. And for static shock, the source of its damage is how fast you can trigger it with other attacks. So while that first build that I gave him ran solid shock attacks, all 3 of them are, the primary purpose of it is the area of effect damage and the debuffs he can layer onto the enemy line. Focus on blunt attacks with him with the rest of his builds. There are better characters for a static shock team, although he himself is not bad. But in terms of raw blunt damage, he's quite possibly, especially thanks to Worthy, he's probably the best user of blunt attacks currently in the game. And if, as I expect, the female Thor variant that will be coming in Chapter 5, I don't expect her to be a scrapper. I expect Sif to be the scrapper release there. Because of how she is in the comics, the Lady Thor tends to use Mjolnir at ranged as opposed to melee. When she throws it, it flies for her in ways, and this is a quote from Thor himself, from the Odinson, when he first saw the Lady Thor in action, because he accused her of stealing Mjolnir. That he saw her throw it, and he saw Mjolnir bounce and ricochet, almost like Captain America's shield, in ways that the hammer never did for him. Between that and her control of lightning, I expect her to be a blaster, because it fits her character better than a scrapper would. She's a little more fragile than he is. Still very tough and still tougher than almost anybody else in the Marvel Universe, but a little more fragile than the original Odinson was when he had Mjolnir in hand. So I'm expecting her to be a blaster who might be a very interesting pair with this Thor. If both of them have shock and blunt options, but she is a different class with a different focus, I would kind of like to see the Odinson and the Lady Thor running side by side. We'll call those the final thoughts. He's a highly accurate, high damaging character. He's a bit slower. You'll need to find ways to bring that up. He's got some free attack potential. He has some area of effect potential, but his greatest focus is the raw damage when he hits you in the face with a hammer that's bigger than his own head. Until next time, I think the next character is going to be Age of Ultron Vision. Over on the Reddit, I have started a list of the upcoming characters as we'll go through them. That list is not set in stone. New release heroes will always take priority, as well as heroes where I get multiple requests for. Marvel Now Hulk actually moved his way up the list pretty quickly because 3 separate people asked for him. Until I can come back with the next video, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after, this is I Hoagland. I'm out.